Hey Jenna,
Hey Dom,
how's it going?
it's actually going pretty interesting. I've had some wild stuff, or I've seen some wild stuff go down online, which shouldn't be surprising. That's where wild
No,
stuff
but
goes down.
do tell though, what's going
Well,
on?
so okay, here's the deal. So my social media blew up like the other
Oh,
day over this tweet from Megyn Kelly, where basically she was talking to the New York Times about the state of new media, and first and foremost, insisting she is still a journalist, but that we're in a new ecosystem where the old rules don't apply and authenticity is key.
oh wow. I had heard that she's launching like her own podcast network, right? Where she's going to be signing
It's
other
what
content
everyone's doing.
creators. Yeah, and she's going to be talking about news and entertainment space. I mean, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, well, it's I don't know if it's a brave new world, but it's definitely new. So let's start the show.
Sounds good.
Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists.
Are taking a critical look at American media.
So, as always, Dom, everything goes down in the comments. That's where it goes down. And as I was
Always.
scrolling through, always, yes. And as I was scrolling through them, there were some people who were just like, oh my God, Megyn, you're so great. I love your show, but it's kind of an echo chamber, which I thought was
That's
hilarious.
a compliment.
Exactly. I was just like, oh, fun shade. But then some people were criticizing and saying things like, yeah, still a journalist in quotes with like crying emoji. And then other people were just like, none of these podcasts are actually news or journalism. It's all just partisan hackery. So all of this basically goes back to the interview, which is what the Times titled. I swear to God, Megyn Kelly is embracing her bias and rejecting the old rules, and it's by Lulu Garcia Navarro. And so basically, Megyn, amongst many things, she talks about her time at Fox and being at NBC, where she left. If you know, you know why she left. Anyway, the point is when she finally finished her legacy broadcast career, she says, quote, I was like, this industry is a disgusting, toxic stew of hatred and darkness. And why would I want to go back into it? I think that's a lot easier to say when you walk away with millions, tens of millions
Hmm.
of
True. Mhm.
dollars. But
True.
anyway, so then she goes on to say that I just think that mode of journalism is dying, if not dead. I think the future involves direct relationships between individual journalists and their artists or personalities. They don't all have to consider themselves to be journalists. And that's what caught my attention.
Yeah. I mean, I don't you feel, Jenna? We've seen this trend. We've been discussing this trend of how whether it's news influencers, this is sort of like the new machinery of how journalists are. You become a personality, and that's a way to grab an audience.
Totally.
Um, Um, and it's interesting. So now, full disclosure, you know this, but like I worked at Fox News back in the early 2000s, and I, I had come across Megyn Kelly back there when she first started, and I didn't. If I work with her, I'll be real, I don't remember that time period very well. I really don't. I
Some
tend to
things we
like my
mercifully
career.
block out.
I just, but it's also like so much stuff to remember. But I remember seeing her. Maybe I might have worked on something with her, but never enough to even know um, that much about her personally or anything. She was always very nice back then to me. But she was,
I've heard
I
that
will
about a
say,
lot of people at Fox, actually.
yeah, it's, I will, but I remember then, like you could tell. I mean, she definitely focused more on being. She reminded me a little bit of like a Shepard Smith, where they kind of try to focus on much more of the facts of media versus opinion. And I know as the years went on, and she got her own show, and then she moved to NBC. It became a little more of a hybrid of where personality. And I think that was a time too where
Well,
we
her
noticed.
NBC show was definitely, soft morning news, and that is very personality driven.
And there is where I think, and even then, which is so interesting to me, like that's where she kind of started becoming a little bit more, even once she had her own show over there too, right? She had her own morning show over there, the Megyn Kelly show.
Hmm.
And that became, um, I think it was just a very different, I don't know. It was interesting how that all fell out in the end. Um, I am I mean, I could see why she doesn't want to go back. She got, like you said before, she got a lot of money.
If I remember
And
correctly, it was like $68 million or something that I was like, must be nice.
you have the ability to build your own, you don't have to play by anybody else's rules anymore. It's changed. Back in the day, you would have had some people who would have been like, I got to get back on air, but I think she started, and at the beginning, she didn't immediately go out there. It was like it's been a slow burn building up. I just find it fascinating how she's built this and how much more, I don't know if it's that she's become much more open or much more, if this is, you know what I mean? Like, I just find that she's become a lot more opinionated, and it's just gotten to a point sometimes I'm like, whoa, I don't remember this person.
Well,
Um,
speaking of opinions, I mean, Lulu does point out that the way the algorithms work, because again, if you're going to be in the digital space, it's about
mhm.
working the algorithm. And she says that the way the algorithms work right now, they elevate individuals so that you have a personal relationship with the person who's giving you, news or information or entertaining you or whatever. And so Megan responds, yeah, that's why conservatives are dominant. She doesn't say it. In my mind, I imagine that's how she said. That's why we're dominating, and basically says because, in her opinion, there's more conservatives in the country right now than there are liberals. That might be a debatable point for some people, but that's what Megan says. So anyway, she does go on to though clarify that she does still see the value in traditional reporting, which we've talked a lot about. Reporting versus analyzing the news and giving your opinion about the news, saying, she subscribes to the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, et cetera, because she basically couldn't do what she does without the content that reporters deliver.
I mean, I appreciate at least hearing that because you and I have discussed this. No, it's like people do this all the time where they'll use content of reporters and then just use it as if it's their own, and they create this whole,
We always
conversation,
acknowledge here
debates.
at Laid Off and
We
Looking.
we do, to the point of where we like to say it on air. We like to include links to the articles. We like to give credit to the reporters. All these things. Like, it just makes, to me, it just makes sense. And I feel like I appreciate having, and it's hopefully that's going to be a trend that will be building. Whether or not you're using that content to
Fingers
create
crossed.
to start your debates, but you know what I mean? Like, you're using that content to create debates and create discussions. That's a whole nother story. My thing is just like, if you also, as long as you're not, I guess people use that as this whole discussion of what's real and facts versus, because that's the other part of it too. When we call about real news, fake news, which I hate even saying that term, but we know that's just
Well,
been
I would
something
say
that,
fake news and misinformation isn't the same thing as news analysis or even a well researched opinion,
right.
which actually leads me into a conversation that I had. So, the hubbub over the interview made me think of this story that was published by, full disclosure, the left leaning nonprofit Media Matters for America. They published this piece. The right dominates the online media ecosystem, seeping into sports, comedy, and other supposedly non-political spaces. And so I talked with the author of that piece, Kayla Gogarty, and basically asked her what it was that she found.
The right is doing really well in this space because they're meeting the audiences where they are, and they've always been good at evolving. When we first saw when that people were getting their news from Facebook more so, for instance, the right was really good at pushing out content there and really exploiting the algorithms to get that content to people. Because the algorithms often are going to prioritize outrage, fear mongering, other evocative content as opposed to dry facts and statistics.
I mean, that all sounds like I get it. You know what I mean? Like it's all very true. Outrage, fear mongering, and that kind of content does drive up engagement. I just don't think that it's only in the conservative or right leaning content. I mean, everybody does that. I mean, right? I mean, or I should say everybody. Many outlets, many content creators do that because it's how you
It feeds the
get people.
algorithm. It keeps
It
people.
does.
I mean, again, the best example, and I'm going back to legacy media now, was Howard Stern. Howard would do the most outrageous stuff on the
Yeah.
airwaves because people listened because they liked it. People would hate listen. Either way, they're listening.
Yeah. And there are lots of podcasts or lots of content that will grab your attention. I've seen it. Like there are plenty that I listen to that, they have these great captions. They have, it's like the thumbnails catch your attention. You're out there like, oh, what's going on? What are they saying? And then they say outrageous things. They know that it's clickbaity, but it does get people to listen, and it's the only way you're going to get hurt. So I just don't think it's only that. I think that they're having their moment. How about that? They're having their moment because they have it. I do think like there is a moment where you're seeing a lot of these conservative. It's been a few years where it's been conservative content creators have been having a moment, but that's because I think that they haven't been as open
Well, true.
of being out
Also,
there.
though, when we're talking about the online space, and this is part of one of the things that I did ask Kayla was, is this kind of like a chicken or the egg thing? Meaning that when you had something like YouTube come online, more conservatives who might have felt marginalized in more legacy media spaces just flock to there because I can say what I want, I can be who I am, etc.
Hmm.
And so if there's just more people doing that in that space, then wouldn't it of course be look lopsided as opposed to that's what more of the country wants? Because again, we're only talking about online content.
Hmm.
Anyway, so moving on. So a Pew Research study actually found that there were that not only were podcasts a source of news and information for people, but when people heard news discussed on said podcasts, only 87% of them expected the news to be mostly accurate, which, okay, as a journalist, somebody who has broken my back and my mind trying to, y'all are only looking for like, good enough is fine. Like, what? Anyway, that part blew my mind. But then the second part of the Pew Research study also caught my attention, and that's where it pointed out that 31% of people said that they trust podcasts more than other news sources, which again broke my journalistic back.
and I get why too. You know what I mean? But this is I know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know what it is? It's that sense of you're just taking one person's opinion and you don't there's no backup to make sure the information you're getting
I
is
believe that's what the
100%
good
correct.
people at Trusting News kept trying to drive home. It's like, please
Yes.
have two or three sources.
Yes. And I think that's the part that you get really frustrated with. It's like anybody can just do it and not have put the work in to back up the information, to verify sources, to make sure that you're not putting out misinformation or disinformation.
Exactly, exactly. So I asked Kayla, I was like, so are we watching the public demand shift from, unbiased or fair and balanced news and information to personality driven information? And here's what she said.
Well, I think when people are tuning into their shows, they're not necessarily going for their news and politics related content. They're going to see their favorite comedian, interview another comedian, or
Okay.
go see their celebrity, that they like to follow, in an interview. But then, along with some of these, comedy interviews and different things, you start to see the politics kind of creep in.
So Kayla does make it very clear that people want right now authentic comment and that comment, excuse me,
Content.
content, but comment authentic comments about authentic content, I guess what it is. No, but they like the storytelling. That's really what's getting to people. Now, I thoroughly understand that from the perspective of having written features or things like that. Like, yes, you have to be able to tell a good story, to craft a good narrative, to give your audience something to connect with. I completely understand that. But sometimes when we're talking about hard news, what?
Sometimes hard. Yes, sometimes it is what it is. I know the other rest of the interview. I know the part of Kayla's research also had to do with showing like the grid of how much content is run by conservative media and then liberal content and comparing. I just sometimes what I do question is, number one, that how it all get, and I know you don't know this because she's not, but what is actually considered to be liberal versus conservative? I think conservative content can sometimes be a little bit easier to identify. I think there's some other people out there, content creators who are not as easy to,
Well, give
people
us
might
some
not.
examples, for example.
I would say like
Some examples, for
call
example.
the Call Her Daddy podcast. We were talking also about John, the Jon Stewart podcast. That I don't know the amount of millions that Jon Stewart has, but I do think there are other, and then there are other podcasts. I just think sometimes there is a liberal bent under it. Yet I mean, I don't always question my host's
Well, these are
politics.
also, yes. Well, so a few things. One, these are also shows that had at least 1 million followers. So like I was kind of surprised because some of the shows that I thought were way bigger, like when we were looking at one of these charts, specifically the total following of top right-leaning and left-leaning online shows, some of them it's just a blue dot with 1 million next to it without necessarily the name of a show. So I don't know, maybe one of those is like Jon
Maybe,
Stewart. But yeah, like I mean I was kind of surprised at how small the bubble was for, the Pod Save America universe and but then also not surprised at how big the bubble was for Joe Rogan, who has almost 40 million subscribers. But then
wow,
I didn't realize that next to that comes Ben Shapiro with 25 million subscribers, Russell Brand with 22. Like, I mean, Jordan Peterson with 23. Like, I didn't realize how big of a platform some of these creators have and why then a lot of people were calling this last election the podcast election because 40 million, 25 million,
yeah,
23 million, even 16 million for Charlie Kirk. That's a lot of people to reach with one
it
pod.
is, it is. I guess it's still one of those things where it's like, they have created this really solid base over the past, this didn't just happen overnight. They've been building since, I would even say, because I don't even recall, like, again, podcast just sort of blew up where people started realizing I could just get on there and start talking and create, and obviously if you connect to an audience that feels like they feel they've been neglected or they feel like they're not being heard, what better place to start this community? We've seen this happen before, whether it be online, communicating, getting involved, getting in touch with people through so many different avenues. So I just think they're really, I don't know. I don't know. It's a lot. There's so much going on in this space, in the digital space. So uh, it's just been really, yeah, a lot.
It was just certainly fascinating to me that I really didn't have a full appreciation of where, at least right now, the data was showing where
Yeah,
audiences were going to for information. But anyway, so that leads us to our episode interview. We reached out to what I think, Dom, is fair to say, an authentic storyteller. That
yep,
sounds right. Okay.
yep,
A self-avowed journalist with a perspective who's been reporting on the rise of conservative or right-wing dominance in media spaces. So take a listen. So, joining us today is someone who is absolutely no stranger to the growing conservative movement, Laura Jedeed. Laura's covered the unique intersection of Silicon Valley and the MAGA movement, and her work has been featured in outlets like The Nation, The New Republic, and Rolling Stone. She also writes a Substack called bannedinyourstate.com. But before becoming a journalist, Laura served in the Army as a signals intelligence collector and analyst, or basically someone who focuses on intercepting foreign digital communications for the purposes of national security. So, Laura, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Jenna, Dom.
So, Laura, I want to start off by saying your military experience seems like a perfect lead into the work that you're doing now. When did at least you first realize that there was a growing cultural shift to right-wing conservatism that was going from fringe to mainstream? Like, when did that first come onto your radar?
It's an interesting question. I grew up in a household that votes Republican, and I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh. So I kind of come from a bit of, I definitely was, existed on that fringe kind of growing up in some ways. And as I grew up and learned some more things about the world and began to, I had about a decade where I personally traveled from quite far in that direction to what I would consider a fairly solid left-wing perspective at this point. I think when Trump won the primary, that was when I realized that a lot of the things that I remembered were kind of coming back or coming into focus and in a new way, a new kind of energy. But I think that was my real wake-up call was when Trump won the primary
And when you say Trump won the primary, we're talking about, oh
in
my God,
2015,
yeah,
2016, long
that feels
ago.
a million years
Oh,
ago.
it really does. Oh my God. What a decade.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Dom?
Yeah. Laura, I have a question too about the difference between the terms when we throw out terms like conservative media, right-wing media, alt-right. They do all have different types of, they all have like different meanings, correct? Not all conservative or not, it doesn't apply for all. So I guess if you could give a little bit of an explanation of how they kind of all differ.
That's such a good question. And I feel like people really sleep on this. And it's kind of nice. I feel like in the past year, there's been a little bit more interest in going deeper than, everyone to the left of Joe Biden is the exact same kind of person and they're all Nazis. It's just not true. We all, I think, maybe perhaps fondly a bit remember the old mainstream conservative types, which are now called rhinos, people who definitely want less government, definitely big on helping corporations, but more or less want America to look like it looks now with fewer regulations. Then you have the populist segment, which I think Trump represents pretty well. This idea, they do take into account some vaguely socialist tenets, but with a nationalist bent, kind of like a national populism, socialist. It'll
Mhm.
come to me. I'm sure there's like a term for this. Anyway, it's the idea basically being that it's not just it's in service of oligarchy, but with a much more populist patina on it. And this is, I think, how Trump managed to get the working class people is this idea that this is, just good old fashioned traditional values. This is just common sense stuff. Um, Within that, you've got the nationalists, which are different. You've got the ethno-nationalists and the civic nationalists. Civic nationalists are people who are happy to, at least on the surface, let people of color into the tent. To them, it's more about whether you're an American versus not an American. And of course, there's a subtext there, but it's definitely very sub for them. And then there are the outright ethno-nationalists, the alt-right that we perhaps remember very ascendant in 2016, post Charlottesville. It was very clear that they'd moved too fast for the American people's comfort. So they kind of receded into the background, and a lot of them rebranded as Christian nationalists, which is another huge, growing, unfortunately, portion of the far right. This extremely militant idea of what Christianity is, this conflation of Christianity and the state, this desire for basically an authoritarian theocracy with fascist characteristics. And of course, now we have the tech bros, Elon Musk and the founder culture, and all the people who have these interesting fantasies of governments that are run like corporations and CEOs that are basically dictators in charge of small city states, essentially. This very like techno-libertarian paradise that I think would be possibly the most dystopian thing that's ever happened on Earth.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the things that really has caught my attention is like there seems to have become this merging of what we used to describe as libertarian ideals or ideas with this conservative movement, and it's morphed into this like new, like what you just sort of described. It feels very much like the tech bro lane. Um, what, from your perspective at least, having covered this, is driving this shift of just like more and more people funneling into this uh, belief pattern, I guess, for lack of a better description?
Yeah. And I mean, I think God, there's so many people who cover so many aspects of this, and I'm just going to speak to what I've seen. I think other
Yeah.
people who maybe go into the more like actually hardcore extremist sectors would have a different perspective. I think that people are very, very sick and tired of the status quo. I think that people are very disillusioned. The right has done an incredible job of convincing people that what we have right now is essentially socialism, like America as it functions today, which is not well. It doesn't function well. You know, people are going bankrupt from medical debt. People have trouble affording basic necessities. Real wages have been stagnant for decades. But they've been convinced that this is what the left has to offer. And they are therefore looking for something else. And that's something that I personally can understand. I think that a lot of that disillusionment has manifested into an inability to imagine a better world, but there's a real appeal in imagining other people suffering. And I think, unfortunately, that's driving some things as well. This idea that I don't think they would ever phrase it this way, but like at least we can get revenge for how much everything is awful.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
of course, there's garden variety racism. I don't want to downplay that. I think everything that happens in this country has a subtext of racism. We have a whole history about this. And there's definitely a segment, and I think, you can see it in some of this, like Marco Ella's the Doge guy who got fired for saying just some really things that you would think would be career enders, and of course weren't. He was rehired immediately. So there's that. But I think there's a lot of denial of that on upper levels. It's becoming more overt as we go. But I don't actually think a lot of people necessarily, there's a lot of people who joined this not for that. And then eventually perhaps came around to that. But that's not, I don't think, how they've been recruiting. If that's a very long and probably incomplete answer, but that's what I've got.
I think it gives me a better, no, it gives me a better concept,
Yeah.
because again, we've been seeing this, yeah, mesh, I guess, which like almost like a perfect storm, at least from my perspective, is what
Yeah.
it seems like.
Laura, I know there were like David Sachs, of course, famously like was very aligned with Biden and the left. And of course, even, now has aligned with Trump. My question is, when we're talking about people we're talking about billionaires, these heads of these companies, do they ever really, when they tell us they align with someone, is it ever really because of the fact that's what they believe, or should we really be aware of the fact that it's because of the money? You know what I mean? It's because of the fact that a lot of these companies, they're going to go with whoever they see is going to help them more. It has nothing to do with politics, really.
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely a large segment of the upper class, the top 1%, who have shifted over to Trump for exactly this reason. CEOs, I mean, they did, Pride Month and Black History Month because it was profitable. Now it
Yeah,
isn't, so they've stopped.
yeah.
I think that's something that's really interesting to see, and hopefully something we can all carry forward. This idea that capitalism isn't moral; it's amoral. It's just it does whatever makes money. However, I do think that there is a subset of the tech billionaires, the tech bros, that they're a little bit of a different situation. I think their support of Democrats had that characteristic, but I think they now believe they can take over the Republican Party. They've gone from believing that they should basically control the tech world to believing they should control the world. They think that they would be better and more efficient at running things than our messy, squishy politicians with their transactional costs and our debates. And, it's inefficient. So they'd like to come in and change that. So I do think for a subset of these tech bros like Sachs and Mark Andreessen stands out to me as well. These are people who would like to be in charge at this point. And I think that's a change.
Well, speaking of, again, sticking with the tech bros and how much they would like to be in charge, like it or not, they also, in a lot of ways, are the arbiters of the news and information that a lot of us get because most people are now going to social media, like hopefully finding this podcast. And so my question is, how does that belief system that, like Dom said, this is about making money. At the end of the day, these are businesses looking to make money. How does that impact journalism as a discipline? Because if you have people who own these legacy media outlets, or more importantly, the media that people are able to see, who are determining how they're going to tweak algorithms or maybe what angle that stories are going to be taking, how does that impact the news that we're able to get?
I mean, on every level, I think. And I think it has been for a long time, escalatingly so. I feel like, I mean, I don't know if wake up call is quite the right word, but I do think a lot of people's eyes were a little bit opened when the LA Times and Washington Post very abruptly pivoted to Trump in the last days of the election. That was, I mean, this is what happens when billionaires run corporations that do news. Then you've got things, I mean, honestly, Blue Sky is one of the only platforms left where journalism content is not nerfed. Yeah, fingers crossed that
Fingers
stays the
crossed,
case.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, Twitter, if you're a right-wing pundit, of course you're having a field day. Instagram, Facebook nerfs political content. TikTok does their best to nerf political content. Gen Z is good at getting around that. Massive respect for that. But yeah, it's I feel like there's I don't think the people that think that they know best certainly don't want us filthy plebs weighing in on that too much. And I do think that's having a huge impact. And unfortunately, because the media landscape is basically either you have to have a billionaire patron or generate clicks. And so what you get then is, you know, ideally you get some kind of like benevolent dictator situation. I think that's true with some outlets. Or you get something like the Washington Post where someone's got the finger on the scales a little bit. Or you've got something like the Daily Mail where they would just like you to click, please. Please just click.
Just
You
click.
know?
Just click.
So
Just
the more
click.
yeah, just click. And so, of course, that means that, it's basically that the tabloid incentive is huge. And the
Mhm.
more newspapers pivot to tabloid-like coverage, the less people respect them. And the less people respect them, the less money there is in journalism. And yeah, it's not fun. This is a dying industry, and I don't like it.
Well, you explain putting it all this way, Laura, is there any way then for news to ever be impartial? You know what I mean? Can it truly be impartial at this stage? Or has it ever, another thing too is, has it ever really been impartial? I think we all had this like notion of, people would throw out the Walter Cronkite days of yore, and people will be like, oh, that was a time where you, but I often question, was it ever really impartial and can it be?
You've just wandered onto one of my favorite rant subjects. I do not believe that there is any such thing as objective journalism inherently, like no matter how hard you try. Even if you even if you're simply listing facts, you still have a limited amount of space to list those facts. So the journalist has to decide which facts matter and which ones can be left out. So there's always going to be bias in every piece of media you consume. I actually think it's incredibly unethical to pretend otherwise. I find the kind of like detached New York Times Walter Cronkite voice, if anything, to be less ethical than what I would consider the path of saying, hey, this is me, this is what I believe, and here's my news story. I personally am very open about my beliefs. I think everyone should know that I'm very much on the left, that I very much believe that in a more socialist economic system, people should know that going in so that they can decide how to take what I do. And then you just do your best to present facts as they are. You do your best to present even facts that contradict your position or would appear to, but that's the best we can do. And unfortunately, this odd myth of objective journalism and the very clear falsity of that. Like, I think everyone can look at that and then look at the news and say, whatever this is, that's not objective news. And then they get upset. And I think that's a reason why things like Fox News and Newsmax have been able to sneak in, because if the New York Times is objective, why not Fox News? I mean, one of them sounds more objective. One of them has the aesthetics of objectivity, but I don't think either are exactly, the word of God.
You know,
That, oh, Dom,
oh,
what
go
were you
ahead.
gonna say?
No, I was just going to say, Jen and I were talking before when I was thinking of questions for you. One of the things I had was there was this setup, I believe, by, when the Rush Limbaugh started in the 80s, there was this perspective that they were selling that mainstream media was against you. And my thing was, yeah, but you know what? Like, really, was media really ever truly liberal? Because I think that when you come to these big media companies, they're all about profits. So maybe some of the people behind the scenes, the reporters, maybe some of the people are, um, but ultimately, news, they're for these big companies, they're not going to put a story out unless the ratings are up. I mean, it was so driven by, back then sweeps and all those things. So I guess the question is, has it ever been proof that media really was leaning liberal over the past number of years, or is that just a fallacy that people sell just to build up another empire of conservative?
I think that's such a good point. I think that in the sense of like neoliberalism, as in, capitalism our system is pretty much good as it is. That, which I mean, I guess that really is kind of the definition of conservatism, like everything is fine as it is. I think that is definitely a force in media. I do think a lot of elements that are unfortunately more mainstream now were more fringe. Back when I was growing up and listening to Rush Limbaugh in the car all the time, those ideas were very, they were out there. Lots of people listened to that show, many people. Um, and I think that in a way that was, I suppose, mainstream in a way that certainly Limbaugh wouldn't have liked us to think that it
Yeah.
was.
Mhm.
But it was also very different from what you would find on like CNN or NBC. And as time goes on and as we enter this new era where the Trump administration is clearly happy to bring down whatever power they can find onto anyone who commits thought crime, I think you are seeing a bit of a drift more in the other direction. And I expect to continue to see that as the consequences for speaking out grow more severe. So I definitely don't think there was any kind of like paradise there. At no point did we have some kind of, beautiful liberal or progressive media sphere that's not the case. And in some ways that is almost hopeful to me because it's not, although I certainly wish we could go back a few years and I could live in that time again, it was never good. We were
Mhm.
always kind of on a road to here. And so we are now traveling this road. I expect it to be a rather dark one, but it's not like we've lost something perfect. Maybe we can make something better.
Well, speaking of making something better, I was struck by you wrote this article in the New Republic of January of this year, where you're basically talking about how a city like San Francisco, which had been, this alleged liberal bastion, or at least painted that way, had actually become an epicenter for anti-progressive movement that was financed by the ultra wealthy, hoping to blur political lines and centralize power for the long term. And one of the parts of the article that struck me, you wrote that the tech elite in San Francisco were aiming to redraw political lines so that conservatives can feel at home on both sides, and progressives are boxed out of politics as dangerous communist radicals. But progressives aren't actually radicals in this story. That moniker belongs to some key players at the top of this so-called common sense movement, those who yearn to replace nation states with anarcho-capitalist startup societies which are ruled by philosopher king CEOs. So my question to you is, with that in mind, first of all, that sounds almost textbook for some of the things that we're seeing happening at the national level now. Um, was America, and more importantly, was legacy journalism prepared for this kind of a just hardcore radical shift where um, you had a demographic, believe it or not, a growing demographic that had enough money to actually reshape society in the way that they wanted to see it? Or had that always been the case? And again, we were just sort of under this illusion of the society being something different.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the tech desire to take over the world is a recent development. I think that there's certainly, there is at no point in the history of this country have corporations not wanted to, or since the Industrial Revolution anyway, have corporations not wanted to have a very big hand in government. The way I saw it phrased, I think this might have been Gil Duran who put it this way. I can't remember, but that there was a time where corporations wanted to influence policy. Like they wanted laws that benefited them. And that up to about 5 years ago was the case for the tech bros as well. And at a certain point there was a pivot, and I think this is important. A pivot from we want to influence policy to we want to make policy. And it's similar, but it's not the same. They no longer are content to kind of put their oar in when laws directly affect them. They want more control than that. They want cultural control. They want social control. I don't think legacy media was prepared to deal with that. I don't think the liberal establishment as a whole was prepared to deal with that. I've at times, I think liberals and even progressives to some extent lack imagination. And I don't mean that even in a pejorative sense. I actually think it's kind of beautiful that they can't imagine a world where people would simply destroy institutions because it's funny or because they don't care if people starve, or imagining that somebody might prefer civil war to a society where we don't have that in the name of making something better happen. And again, I feel like I've brought this up like 5 times and I don't usually. It just keeps coming up. one of the things about growing up listening to conservative media is you don't have that problem. Conservatives have no problem imagining civil war, even if they don't want it. They don't have trouble imagining it. They've always imagined it. I'm not saying they long for it. I'm saying that it's conceivable in a way that it is not conceivable to the liberal establishment. It's certainly still, I don't think, is conceivable to the liberal media.
Wow.
I feel like during even the election, there was a period a lot where you saw liberals or Democrats who were not, they couldn't see a time where Trump could be elected again. And they just said there's absolutely no way. He's been convicted of this. He has these other court cases. And it was frustrating because having seen, I've worked in conservative media before, but I also know that in the end, you always have to be thinking ahead, and you can't just think the public is just going to fall in line because because he is speaking to a different, he's speaking a different way. He's connecting to people in a different way where they already have shown that they were not looking at those situations. I think that's been so frustrating that the liberal and Democrats just have not aggressively gone, have not. I don't like. It's just been very frustrating. I've talked about it a lot with Jenna, and I know I'm just
No, I mean, it fits like we saw leading up to the election, like with the exception of maybe a few newspapers where CEOs stepped in and said, no, we're not going to do that endorsement. But we saw endorsement after endorsement from, op-ed writers, et cetera, endorsing the Harris ticket. And, people interviewing experts and professors and thinkers and all these people who were all ringing the same alarm bells, and yet the public went in a different direction that seemed to catch everybody off guard.
Yeah. I mean, and I think this relates directly to kind of what we were talking about with the media. Like, I think the media no longer holds the kind of power that they think they did at one time. I don't think that these expert analyses carry the weight that the experts would like it to. I think that, part of the problem, and I am broadcasting live from Brooklyn. I don't come from Brooklyn, but I live here now. I love it. I don't ever want to leave. Also, a lot of news media is in New York. We all are, I think, all of us right now, currently in New York City. Great place. Not like the rest of the country, though. There's a real bubble here. There's things that happen. Like this is not a serious example, but I feel like it encapsulates it, where people when gas prices go up, people just say, well, then that means people should drive less. And like in New York City, that's a very sensible thing to say. Where I grew up, if you don't drive, you're not going to get groceries. It's a half-hour drive for milk. And that's a lot of places in the country are like that. And that's not, that specific thing isn't what's the matter, but it's indicative of a larger problem, which is I think you have a very kind of rarefied bubble of people who are not able to really connect to the concerns of everyday Americans. And this isn't to say that Trump is solving those problems, and it's not to excuse the people who decided to push the big red button that has been pushed here. But it is to say that I think that a lot of the tactics that were used by mainstream, by what I'm going to call, God, here I am using it, by liberal media, by Democrats, by the Beltway establishment, a lot of those tactics were aimed at people that they know and that they go to have beers with, but not necessarily things that were going to connect with the general public. Like when they took that mugshot, and everyone I know was so excited about that damn mugshot. And I'm sure it was very cathartic for a lot of people to see that mugshot. Within a month, that mugshot was on half the shirts at Trump rallies, which I was going to. I mean, they loved it. It's what did they think was going to happen when you get a group that is so heavily influenced by Christianity and then make a martyr out of their leader? Just unbelievable stuff like that. The McDonald's thing where they were making fun of him. Oh, it's staged. He didn't really work it. Of course it's staged, but they liked it. People liked that he was doing McDonald's, and they didn't like that people found it like gauche that he was in McDonald's. Look, I'm not saying it was like it was a very stupid moment. I'm not defending the moment, but I just feel like there's a real disconnect between what people, I think, that are kind of in control of media or the Beltway are seeing and what somebody who lives in a small town is seeing. I just don't think it's the same.
That's always been the frustrating part, though, Laura, for me, is the fact that, what people end up doing, they focus on these moments that actually help build up it helps, because it helps to go for, I think, for some people to feel as if he is being persecuted, he's being targeted, and therefore it builds up a kind of you're not going to mess with. It's just like it's just done the wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't report it. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
shouldn't be the story that you repeat over and over and over again because I do think it just sets up a way where people then start thinking you're going against them. I think you report it and then you have to start a fight. Like there are other stories that are out there that are impacting every, all Americans, and just to focus on that one and think that's what's going to be it's going to end his run for office. I just thought it was really naive by many people's standards.
Well, I
Yeah.
just
No, I
think it's such an interesting point, just especially from our perspective as uh journalists, I guess freelancing in this technically unemployed space. I don't know what you want to call it anymore,
Yeah.
but how many? No, because early on in our podcast series, remember, Dom, we
Yeah.
spoke with Paul Farhi,
Yeah.
who I think used to write for the Washington Post, and one of his
He was,
points was that too many of us are in the Beltway and New
yeah.
York.
Yeah.
And so if
yeah.
you're, just a person or an individual in Idaho and Missouri or whatever, we literally come across as like almost like we're speaking a foreign language, which in a lot of ways I think we are. Because I know when I visit my cousins like south of the Mason-Dixie, half of the stuff that they talk about, I'm like, what? So yeah.
Yeah.
But so with all of that in mind, though, I do want to also bring back to one of the points that we always try to hammer home with this podcast, and that is the difference between different types of journalism. So, Laura, how would you describe the work that you do? Would you call it more opinion writing or analysis writing or just straight reporting? Because one of the things that we found, and a lot of other, experts have also found, is that the American public, yeah, those lines are getting incredibly fuzzy for a lot of people, and they aren't as clear on the difference between different things. And so a lot of times when I find that the public gets outraged with the media, I go and I look back at the article that they're outraged with, and I'm like, that was an opinion piece. That's what?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I would say, I mean, my work varies a little bit. On the Substack that you mentioned, bandinyourstate.com, that's
Mhm.
more opinion writing and analysis. Most of what I do for larger publications, I would call investigative reporting with a perspective, with a position. So I do, and I think I make it fairly clear in the things that I write where I stand on whatever issue I'm reporting. But I am going in, I'm trying to do real fact finding. I'm trying to do real analysis. I'm trying to uncover things. I'm not just expressing an opinion. I'm taking as many facts as I can find and then turning that into a narrative that I think makes sense. And again, making it very clear where I stand. And that's how I've my personal way of dealing with the moral question of how does one do journalism in a way that is honest and upfront. And that has been what I have settled on is just this is me, this is what I believe, and here's the facts as I see them. And not to, I think it's been somewhat successful in that I have conservatives who read my stuff. I get emails, not as often as I used to, but often enough. I get feedback from people who say, "Hey, I disagree with you on everything, but I read your stuff because I feel like you at least are honest." I've written things on my Substack where I've called out some of the misquotes of Trump. There was an especially egregious one, I feel, where in an Ohio speech, he said that there would be a bloodbath if he wasn't reelected. And it was absolutely bait, and journalists absolutely took it. But in context, he was very clearly talking about the auto manufacturing industry. Now, I think we're seeing that the bloodbath happened when he was elected. I think we're seeing that. I mean, it was a lie, but this idea that he was threatening bloody civil war, which a lot of people in the media took and ran.
Yeah.
And I think that's how you lose people's faith. That's how you lose trust. And I think it's what I try to do with my work is to always be the person who's like, now, wait a second, that's not true. Not because I'm trying to defend Trump, but because I think that makes criticism of Trump land harder when I go to the mat on it. So,
You, or it's interesting, like how, because as an independent journalist, you have so much more power to say, represent yourself and put yourself out there however you want to put out. How does a journalist, though, the journalists who work for larger media institutions, legacy media companies, how can they sort of rebuild? Is it even possible to rebuild a relationship with readers in terms of being honest about same thing, like about where they're coming from on certain stories? How do we sort of extend that to larger corporations where it's obviously it gets a little bit more complicated, but can it be done? And if so, do you think they can do it?
I mean, I don't know if corporations would even want to. You'd hope that they would, but I genuinely think what we need is a cultural shift in how we view what the news is. I think we need a cultural shift where people stop talking about wanting objective journalism, and where large corporations stop pretending that they are delivering objective journalism. I think there needs to be just a shift in the way we look at media, that no, it is never going to be objective. Yes, it is always going to have bias because human beings are biased and robots are programmed by human beings who have bias. So you're never getting away from that. And then going from there and saying, look, we're going to hear the facts as we see them, and, do with that what you will. But if we keep pretending that there's something called objective journalism, then people are just going to keep claiming that mantle for whatever they're doing, very much including things like Newsmax and OAN, where what they're doing is some kind of propaganda, I would say. I think that's got it. That shift, that cultural shift has to happen.
It seems like, I mean, something is taking place, because of course speaking of, like liberal media and I guess liberals and perhaps Democrats in general, there's been this like just wave of anger of A, how did you fumble the bag this bad? And then B, my God, do something. Now, at the time we're taping this podcast on a Thursday, and this week we just witnessed New Jersey Senator Cory Booker finish this marathon Senate floor speech railing against the Trump administration, the congressional budget, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. Of course, breaking Strom Thurmond's anti-civil rights filibuster record. But more importantly, going back to your work, back before the election, in New Lines magazine, you wrote about how the Democrats can actually win back the white working class, and moving left on economic issues might be the key to winning over blue collar voters of all races. Now, I want to be clear, this article was published before the election that left a lot of people shook. But given that the media, whether or not we deserve it, gets lumped in with all things liberal and Democrat and whatever maligning word that people want to use, how does that, are there any lessons to be taken, I guess, from your article, where there is a winning back of the working class populace, most of whom have turned to, as you mentioned, AM radio or, online podcasts, which we're not maligning podcasts, but for information, et cetera, instead of traditional journalism.
Yeah. I do still think that applies. I think that one of the reasons Trump won, ironically, because I don't think he had any intention to ever do this, and I think we're seeing that now, but he appealed to some of those economically left sentiments. I think that there are, if you don't call it socialism, if you don't use these kind of lefty jargony words, you don't talk about means of production or surplus labor. If you present it in everyday language, the left-wing economic ideas are extremely popular. Polling shows this. People like the idea of not going broke from medical debt. People like the idea of guaranteed jobs. That's actually an extremely popular opinion. That's something that people are very fond of, that idea. There are a lot of things that we feel outside the Overton window to us. They're actually quite popular. I think the problem is that you've got the Republicans who are completely captured by billionaires, and then you've also got the Democrats who are also completely captured by a different set of billionaires and millionaires and donor interests. And so they're willing to compromise to the right as much as you want. They'll compromise on immigration. They'll compromise on social justice. They'll throw trans people under the bus. But God forbid they can't move left because they'll lose their donors. And this is a real pickle, because they will. If they move to these more popular positions, and I think morally correct positions, they will lose donors. And that's a huge problem. With the giant caveat that this only works if we have free and fair elections. But I do think there's a real void here. The Democrats failed to win this election that was very winnable. And it's not, we can talk about margins and say Trump didn't get a huge mandate. He didn't, but this was a really winnable election for the Democrats, and they fumbled it. And that, in theory, should open the door for some alternate ideas for how to attract voters. And I think there's a real war about that going on right now, this abundance movement that's kind of come out, which is connected to the tech scene. It's mentioned in the article that you were referencing earlier, trying to kind of make the Democrats into kind of conservative light a little bit. It's more complicated than that. But this is the point where people who believe in economic justice and social justice, which I think that's the same picture. I think those are two sides of the same coin. Can't have one without the other. But this is a time to really push that, to say, hey, you're right. Like the democratic, the liberal quote unquote system that you voted against, you were right to be upset about it. It was really messed up. It wasn't serving your interests, but neither is this. And here's what might. You know?
Ah, okay. So stop me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like my takeaway from what you were saying was, one of the best things that journalism can do, perhaps, is be less academic about stuff, which I know in a lot of cases we can be, and sometimes situations might demand that kind of language, but maybe to include a more organic explanation of something so that you don't feel as though you're constantly talking over people. Even though I've worked in newsrooms where I remember hearing editors say, no, we speak at this level and either you can come up and reach us or you're just not following.
It's amazing that someone expressed it that way. Of course, I mean, that is the attitude. I guess, of course, it would be explicitly stated, but I think that's exactly right, what you just said. This is not a journalist, but I think one of the best modern examples of this was Tim Walz. He did a great job of advocating for really quite far left economic practices in language that just made sense. This is about helping your neighbor. This is about not being weird. These are things that people can understand, And it doesn't have to be. Unfortunately, there's been so much propaganda against the very idea of democratic socialism or anything that smacks of redistribution. That well has been so thoroughly poisoned. These are not words that can be used, because when you use them, people think of something very different than what you mean. What we mean is helping our neighbor. What we mean is making sure everybody has good things. This is a very long way of saying I completely agree with what you just said.
So, Laura, at the end of the show, we always ask a final question, which was, what led you to becoming a journalist, especially after your time in the military?
Well, this is going to be a weird answer. I love writing and I love history. I originally wanted to be a historian of World War II, and then 2016 happened. I thought maybe politics would be similar, so I switched to that. But journalism seemed like a good way to unite my interest in writing and in politics and history and the way that the world plays out. I fell into this backwards. I'd been trying to break into journalism. It's not an easy field to break into, especially if you don't know what you're doing or how to pitch or who to pitch to. But when the pandemic hit, I was living in Portland, Oregon. And when the Black Lives Matter protests started, I went as an activist for about a month. And at a certain point, the police began to specifically brutalize journalists out there. And so a lot of local and national publications withdrew for a time. They came back when the feds came. But at the time, they withdrew their people from the field because it was too much of a liability. So a bunch of us were like, well, we're just going to start documenting it on our social media. So I did. And then I found out I really liked that. And then I very consciously decided to, cut myself off from the activism angle. I was going to document and be very clear about my sympathies, but document and not at all participate. So that was, my account blew up. I came up on Twitter, and then I had a viral post that I was able to parlay into an opinion piece for Rolling Stone, which I was able to parlay it into an investigative piece for Rolling Stone. And now I'm here, but it's been a strange journey. And it's what I've always wanted. It's so cool to be able to do this for a living, to just be able to talk about and research things what a gift,
I could not agree
it.
more. Could not agree more. Laura, thank you so much for joining us and sharing, your unique perspective on not only just the rise of conservative media, but also how that has impacted the news that we all consume, because that's where our attention is.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for inviting me on. This is an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.